Hey everybody, I hope you're having a great week or since last week. Um, I enjoyed reading what you're thinking about, the kinds of applications you're thinking about with your own practice. And I liked some of the responses that you were given to each other about each other's practices. It's such a good way to learn from and with each other, just to think about other people's ideas, to come upon other people's ideas and then think about how we can incorporate those into our own practice. What I was thinking about was we incidentally we read some Paris in my PhD seminar for this past Monday, and we had such a great conversation about teaching and all of the issues that people talk about in education all the time. And actually, some of you mentioned it in your post, and so I think that but I will tell you again that the teaching workforce is 83% white women in our country, and there's a reason why it's majority white, and that has a huge history. That's because before Jim Crow and before, from slavery up until desegregation, we had lots of black teachers, and then they were forced out of the profession when we segregated. When we desegregated. And so there's a big history behind that. But before that, and since, there have been amazing classroom spaces with all black schools, with black teachers doing amazing, beautiful things. And so what I want you to think about is, as you're, some of you mentioned that you learn about culturally relevant or responsive or sustainable pedagogy in your undergrad program, or that you are now. And, I think it's important for us to think about that broadly across cultural contexts. So a couple of points. One, I remember doing an observation for a pre-service teacher a few years ago in a very white rural space in Georgia. And the pre-service teacher was doing some lesson where she was using restaurants. And she was having the kids talk about their favorite place to eat out. But it was in this town that didn't have a restaurant. So there was like a McDonald's and a Wendy's. And the kids didn't know what she was talking about. And she had terminology and vocabulary that they had never heard of that went with restaurant, like higher end restaurant discourse. And I just remember sitting there thinking, you have been in this classroom for a whole semester and you don't know that they don't have restaurants, the kind you're talking about in this town. Like, you haven't looked around when you're driving to the school. You haven't talked to your kids. You haven't listened to the kids about what they're talking about. And so that's just so important. And so what that goes along with, one thing is, if we're just getting to know kids, then we learn about their culture, like many of you were talking about, just what they like, what they don't like, how they live. And it doesn't have to be a judgment. It can just be an observation. If you think about mindfulness practice, we don't have to judge or label. We can just observe and be receptive. And to do that work is really difficult, to work against our own cultural and historical locations and think that somebody else is normal. If it doesn't match my normal, that it can't be normal. And it's a lot of work for humans in general. But just getting to know humans, that's the work, is listening and asking questions and just being open and receptive and taking all that into account. I mean, if you think about Louise Moll, that's Funds of Knowledge, if you've read that work. And that is I didn't have you read that, but if you haven't read that, that's Moll was doing, and others were doing work with Latinx communities, and taking what they learned from doing home visits and things, and taking what they learned from families and bringing that into the classroom. And that's what all of this is about. So if you teach, some of you wrote about, that you teach an all-white school or predominantly white school, that doesn't mean, like I said in the post last week, white people, everybody has culture. And it's just getting to know humans one of my doc students the other night, who's an African American male, was talking about that he first taught in a predominantly black school and got to know his students that in that space, and now then he went to a predominantly white school, and now he's in that space, and then he was in that space, and how he knew nothing about his kids, nothing, and he felt so disconnected and didn't know how to connect, and so he had to take the time to get to know his kids, and then he had beautiful relationships with them because he was learning about who he was sharing space with. Another thing we talked about in that class that I wanted to share with you is, every practice isn't good for every kid. And so culturally responsive, relevant, sustaining pedagogy it always doesn't just have to mean, now let's bring hip hop into the classroom if I teach Black and brown kids. That's very dangerous. And a lot of you wrote about that you appreciated Ladson Billings saying that now her work has been watered down, and it is. It's what we do in education. I talk about this all the time. We pick something up, we sweep it up, we implement it immediately without actually understanding what we're implementing and what the consequences can be and what the possibilities can be. And so, I love that you appreciated Dr. Love's videos, and just because you have Black students in your class doesn't mean they can rap or that they like rap. So that's just be careful with assumptions and be careful with generalizations. And just think about, for me, I try to think about culturally responsive, relevant, sustaining pedagogy as just getting to know the humans who I'm sharing space with. What are their likes and interests? What scares them? What moves them? What are their passions? I had a parent-teacher conference with my daughter's teacher yesterday, who's 5, not the teacher, my daughter. And she was saying, Riley's really musical. Have you ever thought about putting her in some kind of music class? She matches pitch, and she knows the word to every song they sing. They'll sing one word of one song, and she'll know exactly which song they're going to sing. And I said, yeah, I know, she does that at home too. And that's the job. I mean, that's the Montessori philosophy, is really going into the children's world. And that should be the job of every educator, is just, some of you read about that too, meeting kids where they are. And that doesn't have to mean academically, which brings me to another point. In this country, in education, in public education mostly, but in private too, we think of intelligent or smart in very narrow particular ways. And those are very, some people would say Eurocentric. And so very white, middle to upper middle class. So if you're smart, then you study all the time, you have a certain vocabulary, you have a certain diction, you might not have an accent. If you have an accent, that people, don't take you as seriously. You test well, those kinds of things are how we think about intelligence. And what we talked about in our class Monday, that some of you wrote about too, that Dr. Love talks about, is there's so many different ways to see how smart kids are. And the same doc student who was talking about being in a predominantly Black school and then a predominantly white school was talking about like a football player. So if you think about the new freshman quarterback at University of Georgia, he was talking about how he has to know every play in the playbook. He has to know everything about every position on the football team. He has to think about all of the things he's doing when he's on the field, in the moment and before and after. He has to practice strength and endurance and build those things up. Those are all intelligences. And this isn't about like the 7 intelligence. This isn't about Gardner's intelligence, but it is. But that's been whitewashed too. And people in EdSci really don't like those kinds of things. But it's like about what some of you wrote about, kids drumming on the desk, that really bothers you. But there's a lot going on in that drumming. It doesn't always have to be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It can actually be a beautiful, lyrical intelligence that some kid has. Or kids who, I don't know, can build, you know, just are amazing with their hands. I don't know. I think I told you all about that. This kid who came when I taught in Colorado, and he just had so many learning disabilities, and he was so disconnected from school, and he had been kicked out of all these other schools or failed or something. And he came to our school, and he was shy and just so removed. And so then when my social studies colleague and I were best friends, and we just got to know him on a totally different level. And we realized that he was amazing, like a construction guy. He loved to build things. And so we started creating curriculum and learning experiences for him where he could build things, to show us things in social studies and language arts. And his whole personality changed, and he engaged with his classmates, and he had so many successes and we were still doing things for him supportively in the traditional academic sense, lots of scaffolding and lots of whatever was on his IEP, but we also were allowing him to flourish with his natural gifts, and we all have those, y'all. And I know that it feels like the system doesn't allow us to tap into that with kids, but so many of you are already posting this week about you want to interview your students. Yes, you don't have to do it all this week. I know it's exciting and you want to get it all done and everybody's stressed out and you don't have any time, but just take a few kids a week, write them down, make a list, make an Excel chart, a Google spreadsheet, whatever, and just tell the kids what you're going to be doing. And when they're doing independent work or whatever, you're conferencing with, don't call them interviews. That sounds icky and researchy, you know. You could just say, I'm going to have discussions with you, conferences or something, just to conversations, just because I'm interested in getting to know you a little bit more and a little bit differently. And also know that that might feel weird because people don't take time a lot of times to get to know children and youth. And so they might not have anything to say. If you say, like, what do you like to do on the weekends? Well, some kids, they just hang out at their house and play with who's ever next door, and then they watch their brother and sister, and then they help their parents around the house or whatever, and that's what they do on the weekend. And so you have to be careful about how you position questions, because questions, how they're worded, can position answers in very particular ways that can limit what you can find out about your students. So think about asking questions like, you know, what's a fear that you have in the world, or what's going on in pop culture that you find annoying, you know, what person on the radio do you find most annoying and most wonderful, or whatever. Just what's one thing you could change about the world right now if you were given the opportunity. Those kinds of things. And then, like, those things allow for different kinds of conversations to happen. And then once the conversation gets started, then you have to have that wherewithal. Max Van Manen talks about pedagogical tact. I'm going to have you read that. I might do that this week. About listening to what the kid's saying. And instead of, like, you know, somebody might tell you something that's shocking, but you don't have to act shocked. You can just listen and go, oh, that's interesting. Oh, really? Tell me more about that. Or thank you for sharing that with me. You don't have to be like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened to you. It's you know, you don't want to go into, like some of you wrote about, the poor baby mentality. That's not what people want or need. People actually just want to be heard. And you don't have to connect with them and be like, you know, I've never had that experience, but this one time when you don't have to make it about you. Just make it about the kid. In different kind of counseling and therapy literature, they, you know, and Love and Logic also is another thing with parenting and teaching, but they just talk about, you know, restating what someone says is you know, if you just validate someone, like, you know, yeah, that's interesting. I've heard of that person on the radio too. And I can see how that would be hard to listen to that kind of music if it's frustrating, whatever. I mean, that's a bad example. And you can also take the opportunity to be like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of so-and-so. Tell me your favorite song. Or if I'm going to do a music playlist every morning, what songs would you want on there? Because I thought that would be fun for us. So just the kinds of questions that really allow for kids to see that you're actually interested, rather than like your favorite thing to do on vacation. Like that kind of thing is not, I mean, I couldn't even answer that. Like, think about if somebody asked you that, what do you like to do on the weekends? On the weekends, I like to just chill out and like sit and stare at the wall kind of sometimes. So if somebody is asking me that kind of stuff, or like, what's your favorite book, or what's your favorite movie? I don't have a favorite. I have something that I might be thinking about this week, but I could list 100 movies that I love. You could just say, are you watching anything on TV now that's interesting? So just think about, if you're doing those interviews, because several of you mentioned that you wanted to, which I love, that power positioning and perspective. So if you're thinking about the kids' perspective, how you position the question will garner a particular answer. And just thinking about too, some of you are talking about, oh, I'm so excited, I'm going to let my students speak. I'm not going to do English only. Yes, please. Even if it's if it's a rule at your school or something, go ask where that is in the policy. It's not a Georgia state law, so ask where that is in the handbook, and say that, there's great research, because there is, and if you need it, I can send it to you, about letting humans learn in their first language, but you can do and both. So when I taught in Colorado, I had Latinos, Hispanic students, and I always let them read and write in Spanish. Any novel we were reading, I always tried to find in Spanish. They wrote all of the time in Spanish, and then they would also write in English. But I allowed them to share all of their writing in Spanish because it was beautiful. And so they would read it in Spanish and then tell us what it meant after in English. And why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we want to learn from other people's cultures to enrich our own? And we can do that in so many different ways. Like some of you noticed and pointed out, it doesn't just have to be in the literature you have in your classroom. Like, it can truly be in the content that you have, in the relationships that you're building, that you're just getting to know the humans. So, and also some of you were talking about being white teachers, being scared to have conversations with your students if they're predominantly Black and brown. And that, that's the work of white people. So I understand that, and it is difficult, and it's difficult for the people who are oppressed and marginalized every single day of their lives, from the time they wake up until the time they go to sleep, to have to work against whiteness, patriarchy, white supremacy, all of these things. So I think as white teachers, it's our responsibility, I feel like, to always listen, and to learn, just to read and learn everything we can about how to have conversations. And I've told you over and over again, and it's in that article that you read with all the links that I want you to click on, that the best way I know how to learn and listen is by shutting my mouth and listening to the people around me. And even though, it hurts sometimes and it doesn't feel good, and I have to instantly identify, I'm like, okay, that feels icky. Whatever I just heard from this friend or scholar who's African American or Latina or Asian, who just said something about white women, and I need to think about that. Okay, why did that hurt? Well, because I feel like I'm trying to do work, so maybe I want to be like, it's not me, but it is me. So then what can I do differently? So it's like, it's okay to I don't feel shameful and I don't feel guilty. I feel empowered to do something different, and it takes a lot of work, and it's exhausting and emotional, and that's what other people experience all the time who are marginalized. So and some people don't have to if they don't want to. Some people can just be like, I'm not doing that. But I feel like if we're going to be in education, that's our job, that's the work. And if you're in predominantly white spaces, it's really your work, because I've talked about that before too, that's the perpetuating of spitting out the white people into the world, who then go reproduce all of the racist, sexist, classist, ableist, whatever systems. And we can help kids learn how to, I don't know, think differently and more critically, like Ladson-Billings talks about, always is about helping kids learn how to really read the world through critical lenses and deconstruct and ask questions. And, the 3 Ps, man, they're pretty powerful. And any children of any age can learn about that. So that's what I was thinking about from reading your posts and just thinking about what's going on in the country with this midterm elections and what happened in Georgia, and seeing democracy at work, and people getting out and voting who've never voted before, and the reaction in Georgia to the idea of a Black woman being in a position of power stirred up a lot of white people. That might have stirred up some of you who came out and vote who wouldn't have otherwise voted. And I think that's something for us to think about. If we're not having conversations, these kind of hard conversations in our classroom, then, systemic oppression and marginalization and violence continues. So we have a lot of work to do, y'all. I'm going to have you read some good stuff about social class sensitive pedagogy this week, and I want you to, again, think about this across context. So if you work in rural areas, you think about those contexts. If you work in suburban areas, you think about those contexts. If you work in urban areas, you think about those contexts. And when I say urban, I mean actually cities like Atlanta, like metropolitan, and then we'll keep doing some application. As you can tell, I'm kind of lightening up your load because I really want you to be thinking about your final projects and getting creative with those action plans. I am going to do some other pedagogical texts for you too in the next few weeks also, just so you can, some of you are like wanting very specific, how to implement this kind of practice. So I'm going to do some of that for you too. I'm going to do a little choose your own adventure probably next week, before we get out for Thanksgiving. All right. I hope you have a wonderful week and enjoy the things you're going to read.